This person called Rory said, you want to stop overbuilding your arrangements. You don't need those extra 4 synth pads that you can barely hear and they'll just muddy things up. Always serve the song. And he's right for 3 specific reasons that I was able to come up with. For one, the more stuff you add, the more stuff you have to mix. Practically speaking, that's just a math thing. 2, the more stuff you add, the more you necessarily have to distract the listener from the things that are the most important. And 3, at a point, the more you add, the less creative your work actually becomes. And that's a point that a lot of like pseudo creatives like to argue with. And oh, don't I love it, because one of the people that are the most misquoted in terms of creatives that are prolific in this day and age is Rick Rubin. And they probably say something like, well, Rick Rubin probably says to just follow your heart and to add whatever you want to the beat to make it sound really good, and the track can benefit from whatever your imagination says to add to it. But actually, if this nincompoop would bother to read anything that Rick Rubin has actually published, they'd quickly learn that he has a very almost dogmatic creed about why less is more. Like, even just today, I was reading his book, and in a chapter called The Craft Phase, he says the following: in this phase, we begin with a project that has naturally developed. You know, he discusses these various phases that you go through: a phase of exploration, a phase of experimentation, and then you get to this craft phase, right? And then there's another phase called completion, so maybe we need to go through this book. But he continues and says, we recognize the potential in it, this thing that we've created so far, and we see that we can add, take away, or combine to further develop it. He goes on to say, the craft phase is not just a building up, it is also a breaking down. The goal of developing the work can be accomplished through a pruning process of small cuts. We decide which details and directions might be removed so that more energy and focus can be used to feed the core elements. I can't explain this concept too deep because this will turn into a video essay inside of a video essay, but I can tell you that this is the thing that separates the noobs from the people who do this shit for real. This separates those pseudo creatives from the people who live and breathe creative. This kind of understanding that, like, it's not just throwing shit at a wall and just feeling whatever you want to feel. There's a very important process of pruning based on your understanding, your experience, and your taste. So here are a few examples of how I'm using this concept in my single Any Amount. So let's jump back into the project. The best first example I can give you is that there's only one melody usually going on at any point in the track, and this goes back to the big 3 concept of me not really wanting to do too much to distract from those big 3 things. If you actually listen to some of the most tenured and accomplished producers of our time, you'll kind of notice that they have a tendency to have a solid drum groove driven by 4 to 8 instruments at most, good bass, and one solid melodic instrument. You know, I'm thinking of people like Pharrell, Kanye, Chad Hugo. Even if I'm thinking about someone like Zaytoven, who really inspired me to get into production in the first place, I learned a lot about layering melodies from him, but something that I actually noticed in his production is that he only has all of those layers ever stacked for specific parts, like maybe a bridge, the intro, or the outro. Otherwise, it's 1, maybe 2 elements going at a time. And he's a producer more than anybody else who understands the importance of letting that vocal shine and having your beat be a really good template that the artist can perform on. So in this section, there's only one lead melody going.
In your mouth, now them shooters at your house, any amount. He a mouse, so we gotta take him out.
Right here is where we get to pretty much the only part that I've worked on so far where more than one melody is playing. The choir comes on with the lead melody here.
Hey, old Trout, we got rich by running routes. Kept this shit on fucking lock, like my name was Eddie House. Shout out all my...
But then it drops back to the lead again, but this is a different lead now.
Blue bandana on my head. Take a look or take a pic, but get too close and you get clipped.
Goes back to a different lead, and then when we get to this bridge section, it's actually just the choir.
Do anything for Poe, I'll do anything for smoke. Roll some dope, then roll some more, and invite all of them hoes.
You can even see this concept demonstrated a little bit further in my drum programming. The programming itself is very simple. I mean, look at that open hat, look at the hi-hats, which is as complicated as any kind of programming gets in here, and I'm strongly considering just going to a bouncy 2-step kind of pattern. And now I'm kind of in that craft process, as Rick Rubin talks about, of trying to decide if the track maybe benefits a little bit more from a slightly reduced hi-hat pattern. Again, this isn't anything too complicated, but just to let you know about the kind of stuff I think about when I reach that craft phase. But again, simple clap, simple snare bounce, simple 808 pattern. Even the amount of layers itself, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 total drum layers in this entire track. And thinking about it in this way almost forces you, as we were talking about with the melody, to pull things out and add them back in as your track progresses. And a lot of times you might hear in arrangement tutorials or when you get tips about arrangement that you want to do this to keep things interesting. But at least for me, a helpful way to think about it to make my beats better is not necessarily trying to make the beat more interesting, but just so that things don't get cluttered and annoying and fatiguing to the listener, right? And then it being an interesting piece of music by the end of that is kind of just a byproduct of me trying to make it good for the listener in the first place.